Okay, so let's get started. For those of you who don't have a camera but can see the slides, my name is George Gillespie. I'm one of the managers at Volunteer Now. My main role within the organisation is managing Volunteer Now Enterprises Limited. We are the part of the organisation who look after the training, policy and impact assessments and many other things that has become new to us during COVID. You're all very welcome, and all of the volunteers that have joined this webinar, welcome and thank you for volunteering during this pandemic. For the organisations that are joining us on the webinar as well, can I just draw to your attention, you're more than welcome to join this webinar. However, there is a full recording on our website of a webinar that was done not long after the pandemic started, and that was for organisations who are involving volunteers during the pandemic. So I'd just like to draw your attention to that. For those volunteers, and indeed for the volunteer involving organisations who are joining us today, for the volunteers, you might not know, but actually we in Northern Ireland do have a definition of volunteering. And I would just like to draw your attention to this definition. Volunteering is the commitment of time and energy. It is for the benefit of society and the community, the environment or individuals outside or in addition to one's immediate family. It is unpaid and undertaken freely and by choice. When this pandemic started, we referred to spontaneous volunteering. Spontaneous volunteering is when people answer a call to action. Here at Volunteer Now, we started with a campaign, and you'll see that at the bottom of the slide. Let's #help each other. Volunteer Now were astounded by the number of people who actually registered to help during this pandemic. We had almost 4,500 people who stepped up to the campaign to support people during the COVID pandemic. This pandemic is with us for some time and will be with us for some time. So it's really important that as volunteers and indeed volunteer involving organisations, we protect not only our volunteers, but also our organisations. There is a lot of informal volunteering going on, and that is people answering a call. That is people wanting to support their local communities, trying to help the most vulnerable in our societies. And informal volunteering is referred to people who volunteer for organisations that are not affiliated or possibly don't have a constitution, but may have just set up just to support a need within their local community. We then have formal volunteering. That is where volunteers who may have for some time been volunteering for an organisation who has a full support infrastructure, who is constituted, who has all of the policies and practices in place to support their volunteers. So there is a wide range and a wide mix of people volunteering in our communities during this pandemic. If you are an informal volunteer, if you are a formal volunteer, or indeed if you're one of those spontaneous volunteers or one of those organisations who has set up just to help support COVID-19, we hope that this webinar will offer you guidance and support to enable you to continue to volunteer during this pandemic. Volunteering is a two-way process. We refer to the two-way process in volunteering mainly because organisations who involve volunteers have a responsibility to support those volunteers. They also have a responsibility to recognise what volunteers actually bring to volunteering. When we refer to the first part of the relationship, that is that volunteers bring experience. They bring time, credibility, they bring contacts, skills, ideas and enthusiasm to a pandemic, to a cause, to whatever it is those volunteers are stepping up to do in any time of crisis, or indeed in just normal living whatever normal might be at the moment. For an organisation, when they do involve volunteers, they must invest in those volunteers, not only to protect them, but actually to meet the expectations of the volunteer, but also the expectations of the organisation. So as an organisation who champions volunteering, supports volunteers, and supports volunteer involving organisations, we ask that there is clear information given to those volunteers. They are given clear roles in terms of what the ask is of the organisation. They receive training. They are aware that their roles are covered by the insurance that an organisation might have. There is good support for those volunteers, very clear management, a warm welcome, good expertise and good resources. And that is standard when it comes to any type of volunteering, but is also most important when volunteers are volunteering during a crisis or indeed during this pandemic that we find ourselves in. So volunteering safely during COVID-19, what's your role? Are you aware of your safety, and are you aware of the safety of others? We have noticed during this pandemic that there are particular roles that have been extremely popular, and that is either through volunteer involving organisations developing these roles, or indeed changing the way they deliver their services, or indeed informal volunteering. One of those may be the collection and delivery of shopping for vulnerable people within your community. And in terms of this role, and I will go into it in more detail, but one of the top tips when it comes to this is to protect you, never enter their home. And also another tip, if you are doing shopping, confirm the list of the shopping over the phone with the vulnerable person that you might be doing that shopping for. Other roles that have evolved during this pandemic are the packing and delivering of food boxes. For volunteers, you must, if you are volunteering for an organisation, ensure that you are provided with the protective equipment to be able to do that job safely, but also to have awareness or a demonstration of manual handling. You are lifting perhaps boxes, you are packing boxes, and you need to be aware to keep your own physical health safe and intact during this pandemic. One of the other popular roles that has taken place is telephone befriending. Normally, you would hear of a lot of organisations who would offer befriending, and in a normal circumstance, that has been done face-to-face. But what we're finding at the moment, a lot of that is now being done through the telephone. It's worth reminding yourselves as volunteers, if you're carrying out telephone befriending, try to use open questions. Ask the person that you're speaking to, are they eating well? Are they staying hydrated? If they have mental health issues, please do not offer advice in terms of those mental health issues. Signpost them to relevant organisations that may be able to support them. Never get yourselves involved in financial dealings with the person that you may be contacting. There is a lot of boundaries that we as volunteers and as organisations we need to be aware of, even when we are just supporting people over the telephone. Your safety and the safety of others is paramount during this pandemic. This pandemic is invisible to everyone. This virus is invisible to everyone. For you as a volunteer, some really good top tips. Wash your hands frequently. Use hand sanitizer frequently where hand washing facilities may not be available. If you cough or sneeze, ensure that you do that into your elbow. Dispose of the tissue after you have done this. Maintain social distancing, whatever that might be, if it's 2 meters or it's 1 meter with additional precautions. And avoid touching your eyes or your mouth when you have come into contact with anything or anyone that may be in your space whilst volunteering. So what are your expectations, and indeed what are your boundaries? In terms of your expectations as a volunteer, if you're volunteering for an organisation, ask that organisation, what is their expectation of you as a volunteer? What are your expectations as a volunteer? Are you expecting to be reimbursed for any out-of-pocket expenses you may be incurring during this? And that may be driving. Will they reimburse your mileage for driving whilst going and picking up shopping or delivering shopping? Are the organisation supplying you with personal protective equipment? You will more likely hear that referred to as PPE. These are the responsibilities of the organisations. They're also your responsibilities if indeed you are doing your volunteering on an informal basis. What are the boundaries? Organisations that are involving volunteers during this pandemic, and indeed who have historically involved volunteers, will have boundaries for their volunteers in terms of that may be a code of behaviour or indeed different boundaries, and that will depend on the type of role that you're doing. I'd just like to bring some to your attention. If you are indeed shopping for a vulnerable person within the community, we prefer you not to accept cash, but it is inevitable that you may have to accept cash to carry out the shopping for that vulnerable person. Ask them to put the shopping list and the money into an envelope. Ask them to leave it at the doorstep and step back. When you pick up the envelope, and this might sound, oh my goodness, actually photograph what's in the envelope, the amount of money that you are being given and the shopping list. When you've done the shopping, photograph the receipt, put the receipt back into the envelope with the change and leave that back at the door with the shopping and step back. Please do not go into the vulnerable person's home. That vulnerable person may be out shielding. They cannot have people contaminating or coming into their home. So social distancing is most important if you're volunteering in that particular role. Clear financial boundaries. Do not get involved with accepting their debit card, their credit card, going to a cash machine, taking cash out, accepting their PIN number. There are a number of guidelines that government are offering to vulnerable people in term when they find themselves in that position, and they can go on to the COVID-19 section of the government website .co.uk. Most importantly, again, dealing with mental health issues. As a volunteer, you have to protect your mental health, but also do not give advice in terms of the mental health of the person that you may, or persons that you may be supporting. There is a number of organisations out there that not only can support you with your mental health, but also those people who may be shielding or those people most vulnerable. Most importantly, volunteering your time, please do that safely. Please be aware of infection control. Please be aware of protective clothing, washing, keeping yourself hydrated, hand wash, and most importantly, your mental health and well-being. This link that was on the previous slide there will take you to the Department of Health guidelines. There is a number of very clear information for volunteers and volunteer involving organisations in terms of anything to do with health when you're volunteering, and it is a worthwhile website for both volunteers and volunteer involving organisations to visit. Please follow all the guidelines that we have already mentioned. They are there to protect you and protect others. Don't volunteer if you are feeling unwell, please. You're volunteering your time freely. You as a volunteer have the right to say no. You have the right to step back. And please remember that your health is paramount. We as human beings will always want to help our fellow human beings. But in situations like this, and with a virus that we can't see, you really need to be aware of your own health in a situation like this. There is also written guidelines on our website that you can go to. When you open our website at www.volunteernow.co.uk, you will see a large section, #HelpEachOther. If you click on that section, you will see a number of good practice guidelines, and there is one in particular for volunteers. It's worth downloading that guideline, reading through it, but it will cover a lot of what we have been discussing this morning. As we move on to the section of safeguarding, before we continue with this webinar, could I just ask everyone on the call, please be aware to remember confidentiality. If you're aware of anything in terms of the form of abuse in any way, financial, please do not disclose this on this call. If you are aware, please contact either your coordinator within your organisation or indeed a relevant person that you know that can actually deal with this. When we come to the Q&A section, I'm delighted to inform you that our safeguarding manager, Ruth Mulholland, is joining us on this call. So if you have any questions around safeguarding, Ruth will be more than happy to answer those questions. Safeguarding adults at risk from harm and exploitation is of paramount importance in the midst of COVID-19. Safeguarding is everyone's business, and that is regardless of whether you are a volunteer or a volunteer involving organisation. It is actually every human being's business when we talk about safeguarding. Remember, adhere to your organisation's safeguarding policy and procedures. Updates may have been made, there may have been changes to these procedures. It is your organisation's responsibility to inform you of those changes. However, if you are an informal volunteer, please seek guidance from bodies like ourselves that will be able to support you to offer you good guidance and protection when it comes to the safeguarding of vulnerable and adults at risk. Be vigilant for possible indicators of abuse. Report any concerns to the relevant person within your organisation. It is certainly not your role as a volunteer to investigate. Follow your code of behaviour and be aware of the boundaries within which you volunteer. Again, I have referred to some boundaries in terms of volunteer management, but those boundaries will both be applicable when it comes to safeguarding as well. If in doubt, access support from your coordinator or your supervisor. Don't try and deal with the situation alone. And I cannot reiterate that enough. Please do not deal with the situation on your own. The welfare of those that you are helping must always come first, and indeed your own welfare in terms of if something has been disclosed to yourself. Don't deal with it yourself. Reach out to organisations that can help you to do that. Again, COVID-19, we have produced a best practice good guidance publication in our website. This is the link to it. I will, and you will be receiving copies of these PowerPoints. You will also receive copies of the links that will take you directly to these publications. And I'll just show you a screenshot of the publication at the minute. And this is actually keeping children and adults safe. So it is good guidance around safeguarding of adults at risk and indeed children. Again, this is a very worthwhile read, not only for organisations, but also for volunteers who are volunteering with no connection to a particular organisation. Safeguarding training. My colleague Ruth, who is on the call with us, has really put a lot of work into developing and providing online training around safeguarding. Again, when you go into the #HelpEachOther section on our website, you will be able to see a number of different courses that are available. This particular course is open to everyone. It is free. It is relevant to everyone. As I alluded to earlier, safeguarding is everyone's business, not only organisations, not volunteers, but all human beings who live in our society. This is a really good short exercise and training course for you to go on to. There is no cost, and it is entitled See Something, Say Something. This again is a screenshot of the website where you will be able to navigate your way through to find that particular course and register yourself on that course if you wish to do so. Thank you all for attending this webinar. I sincerely hope that you have learnt something from the webinar as a volunteer. We as an organisation feel that we have a responsibility, especially for those 4,500 people who stepped up through our campaign #HelpEachOther, but also for all of those informal volunteers who are actually doing a world and making a world of difference out in our communities at the moment. And for what we can see, this could potentially be with us for 24 months. So this information and this training is vital to all our volunteers, regardless of how you are volunteering within your local community. I would just like to say, please keep safe and please take care and please take note of all the guidance that we have offered you during this webinar. And I would now like to let you know that we will be pausing the recording of this webinar and that we will now go into the questions and answers section.